So folks, this is part 4. And this is when we get into Mitsuyo Maeda arriving in Brazil, teaching Jiu-Jitsu, and the rise of the Gracie family, and how Jiu-Jitsu becomes Brazilian. So before we get into any of this stuff, I want to mention that if you train, you're a part of an exciting story. Well, obviously, I think you're part of an exciting story if you train here at Bellingham BJJ, but just everybody that trains is in the process of co-creating this martial art. Martial arts are affected by the societies that they inhabit. Brazil was one example. America is certainly an example. And so I think it's exciting that we are together co-creating what we want this art to be, because nothing is static, right? And so we're learning more about this all the time. Obviously, Tufi Kairos, Roberto Perdero, Robert Drysdale are doing great work to help enhance our understanding. I hope you will support those folks' work. And spoiler alert for Bellingham BJJ students, I talked to the Pickford today. The Pickford says we can delay our film premiere of Closed Guard to whenever we want. I also had the idea of maybe doing a Fairhaven outdoor cinema of Closed Guard, the documentary, when it comes out, which I think could be really, really fun and would allow us to practice social distancing. More on that later. So in 1914, Mitsuyo Maeda arrives in Brazil. He has been barnstorming through Latin America, starting in Cuba, going to Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, all these other places. He would eventually marry and settle in Brazil, performing demonstrations, teaching, and of course, fighting. He'd also be directly responsible for the most influential family in Jiu-Jitsu history learning his art. But that's a more complex story than it's usually reported. So we're going to dive in pretty quickly. For me, this is the story of how Jiu-Jitsu became a Brazilian art. How Japanese immigrants spread their art, how that art became the national art of Brazil with the help of many, many martial artists, but of course one family, the Gracies, making a profound contribution, though not always in the ways that you might think. We're going to talk about all of that and how it helped bring all of us where we are today. Some of these are stories that you've heard before, but I'm hoping to provide at least some context on some of the ones that you might or might not have heard. So here's our table of contents. We're going to talk about Maeda arriving in Brazil, when he arrives and becomes a new addition to Brazil's existing traveling carnival culture. We're going to talk about how Jiu-Jitsu becomes a Brazilian art. Capoeira predates Brazil. Even Jiu-Jitsu predates Maeda when Sada Miyako starts teaching it in 1908. However, once Maeda arrives, things really start to transform. From there, we'll focus on the Gracies. We'll talk about the Gracies when they're in Belém, after they move to Rio and Carlos Gracie starts teaching and the Gracies begin fighting. I also want to talk about women in Jiu-Jitsu at this point, because I believe we've identified the first woman to train with the Gracies. We'll talk a little bit about how gender plays into this activity, and also how two women, one of whom trained, one of whom did not, impacted the development of Jiu-Jitsu in a way that I think will surprise you. We'll talk about Helio Gracie's fighting career and his retirement. We're going to talk about rules, because the rules of Maeda's barnstorming become different from luta livre rules, become different from vale tudo or no rules rules, and the way that rules evolve really determine how martial arts evolve. As I say a lot in class, rule sets drive behaviors. If you're a wrestler, you want to pin somebody. If all you have to do is submit someone, you don't care if you get your shoulders pinned. We'll also talk about some of the most prominent Gracies that I want y'all to know about, because it's impossible in this more than 100 member family to talk about all the people that deserve our attention. We'll talk about Carlson Gracie, Hobson Gracie, Hickson Gracie, and Holes Gracie, who are some of the most important influential folks over a period of several decades. Then we'll move on to America, when Carly Gracie first and Horian Gracie next reintroduced Jiu-Jitsu to America. Remember, Maeda went to America before he ever went to Brazil and started a school in 1906, which is a fun thing to think about whether American Jiu-Jitsu evolved before Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Of course, that didn't actually happen. But we'll talk about how Carly comes, and later Horian, who's probably more responsible than anyone for the growth of Jiu-Jitsu in America. Finally, we'll talk about challenge matches and competitions up until 1993. We'll save the 1993 to the modern era for next Tuesday, but we'll take it all the way up to UFC 1. We'll talk about the Gracie Challenge. We'll talk about the Dirty Dozen, the first 12 black belts. Yes, we'll talk about Chuck Norris, but mostly we'll talk about Richard Bressler and Craig Cucuck, who, if you haven't heard of, oh, just you wait. Before we get into that stuff, let's talk about the places Maeda travels when he is in Brazil. The first record we have of a Maeda performance is down south in Sao Paulo on September 25th, 1914, when his troupe performs at a carnival. We'll talk extensively about that. According to a copy of his passport that we have, he arrived in Porto Alegre up north a little bit later in November of 1914, and after appearing there, he and his companions moved around the country. In August 26, 1915, they're in Recife. During October of 1915, they're in Belém, which is where the Gracies are at that time. And they finally arrive in Manaus on December 18, 1915. Of course, they travel to the big city, Rio de Janeiro, although not after 1916. Maeda eventually settles in Belém, which his elderly daughter still lives in that place to this day. Just wanted those of you that may not be familiar with Brazilian geography to have a little bit of some context about that. So let's talk a little bit about some of the early figures of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And that guy on the left, Pascal Segredo, never trained Jiu-Jitsu, but he's still as responsible as anyone for Jiu-Jitsu becoming Brazilian. He's an Italian immigrant who comes to Brazil at the age of 15, and he owns the first circuses that are going to host the Maeda trope. Now, when I say that Brazil has a culture of traveling circuses and traveling fights, they're all over. In fact, Roberto Pedreira's books, Choque, which looks like choke to us, C-H-O-Q-U-E, has nothing to do with the Brazilian word for choke. What it really means is performance, implying fight performance. And so it makes kind of a nice pun there as well. But like there's this whole there's this whole culture of, well, what are we going to do tonight? Well, we're going to go to this circus where we'll see acrobats, we'll see musical acts, we'll see people do fight demonstrations, and maybe we'll see people fight. And so all these things travel around Brazil. And when Maeda arrives, he plugs into this. And this is actually what ultimately connects him to the Gracie family. But his first employer over here is Pascal Segredo. And on September 25th, 1914, Maeda's troupe performs at his Teatro Variedade in Sao Paulo. It was described in newspapers at the time as an outstanding success, which is not a surprise because Jiu-Jitsu hasn't been seen in Brazil since roughly 1909 when Sada Miyako leaves. So 5 years of no Jiu-Jitsu. I mean, we've had 3 months of no Jiu-Jitsu and we're all starting to get a little itchy. So imagine how excited people are to see it in 1914. So newspapers just describe it as an outstanding success. The troupe at this time is composed of Maeda himself, Soichiro Sotake, who we'll talk about later, Okura, who they pick up in Chile, a judo guy who's the Chilean champion, Matsuda, and Akiyama. You have to have 4 or 5 guys when you have a traveling troupe for reasons that will become clear later. And some of the guys they'll add are people that we've heard of later. So all of these are Japanese folks that are performing their art. And that there on the right is Maeda and his family who settled in Belém. And on the right is his cute daughter who is now an elderly lady, still lives in Belém. So they stay in Sao Paulo for about 3 weeks or so, performing every day before taking their act on the road and heading for Rio around October 21st. Now, they stop a variety of different places and arrive in Rio March 2015 or thereabouts. So why do I mention this? I mention this because Gastão Gracie, who is sort of the Gracie patriarch, is a business partner of the American Circus in Belém, Brazil. Now, in 1916, Maeda performs a show at the De Paz Theater in 1916 in Belém, which is where he meets Gastão. Gastão will later help Maeda settle in Belém, and in 1917, Gastão's son Carlos watches Maeda perform for the first time. He's 14 years old, and that's when Carlos says he knows he wants to learn Jiu-Jitsu. We'll return to that later. There is not a lot of Jiu-Jitsu in Brazil at this point, as I mentioned, which is kind of a double-edged sword. The good part is you're the only folks performing this art, so you're kind of the only game in town. But the bad part of that is there's not a lot of folks to compete with. And if people don't understand what they're watching, they're not going to become excited about it. So at first, I'll describe what the show looks like. I'll show you what the show would have looked like when Maeda and his crew arrive. But after a while, people start to get bored because if all you see are the same 4 or 5 guys and they're doing the same few things, okay, how interesting is that? And that's what gives rise to inter-style challenge matches. At the time, what's called Luta Romana, Greco-Roman wrestling, is really popular in Brazil. And there are tournaments that happen. There are no Jiu-Jitsu tournaments because there aren't people that do Jiu-Jitsu. So eventually, that's what causes Maeda and his troop to start taking inter-style challenge matches and to drum up interest. And this sets the stage for a really important part of Jiu-Jitsu history, which we'll get into later. So folks, one thing that I would be interested in if I were you, and I hope this is interesting, what would have this looked at the time? If you and I, if we bought tickets to go see at the Teatro, to go see a Maeda performance. So thanks to Roberto Pedreira, who has found playbills and programs, we know more or less what we would have seen. So at first, they would have introduced the troupe and established the offer. So Maeda would offer usually 5,000 francs to anyone of any size or any weight that could beat him. He would offer 500 francs to anyone who could survive 15 minutes with him without quitting or without being tapped out or rendered unconscious. Now, keep that figure in mind later because that's going to blow your mind. So after they make the offer, they'll do the audience challenges. So, hey, Jesse Johns, you want to try your hand with Maeda? All right, we'll bring Jesse up on stage. We'll see if he can last 15 minutes with Mitsuyo Maeda. So they do those challenge matches. In all the research that Pedreira did and all the research that I've done through secondary sources, there is no record of anybody actually winning one of these challenges against Maeda, which is very significant for a lot of reasons. So here's the thing, and we'll remember that monetary figure because we'll talk about it again in a minute. So after the challenges, after it's established, like, okay, you know, the big farmer could not beat up Maeda, all right, they would go to the self-defense demonstration. And troop members would demonstrate self-defense techniques. Now, at first you're like, well, of course they would, Jeff. Why wouldn't they? But what's significant about this is the Kodokan Judo, founded by Jigoro Kano, was not teaching weapons defenses at the time. And we have record of Maeda teaching things like knife defense, club defense, all of these things that were more traditional Japanese Jiu-Jitsu techniques, which Maeda would have learned, but were not being taught at the Kodokan at the time. Now, this may have been a way for Maeda to differentiate himself. It may have been just that Maeda considered himself a fighter first and foremost, but I think it's significant that he was teaching things that would not have been present in Kodokan Judo. After all that, they would show Jiu-Jitsu competition techniques, and which at the time would, you know, again, at the time, the term Jiu-Jitsu and the term Judo were virtually interchangeable. And for those of you that weren't at the first few of these, Jutsu arts are fighting arts. Do arts are arts that are for education, the way, right? The character Ju is the same character in each, the pliable, yielding, or gentle art or practice. But if you were a Jiu-Jitsu fighter, you were a fighter. If you were a Judo guy, that conveyed certain other things. But so right after they did self-defense techniques, they do Jiu-Jitsu competition techniques. So I think it's funny that even then there were distinct motives for training. Some people wanted to defend themselves. Some people wanted to compete. And for a guy like Maeda, both were great. And, you know, I would tend to agree. Rules would play a critical part in the evolution of what we will know as Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So after this, after the competition, they would go over a list of banned moves. Hey, if you do a Jiu-Jitsu competition, here's what you're not allowed to do. Now, it's a relatively small list of moves, which you'll see on the next slide, but they would demonstrate prohibited techniques. At this time, Kano, because he's trying to develop curriculum for Judo, is taking away a lot of the techniques that he considers more barbaric, more low class. He's getting rid of footlocks. He's getting rid of all the sort of old Jiu-Jitsu fighting techniques. And so Maeda's troop shows, okay, these are the moves that you're just not allowed to do. And then they would be matches. And this is why it's really important for you to have 5 folks in your troop. Because imagine, you know, I turned 46 this year. And imagine me and Dave on the road together, scrapping every night. That's tough because they're doing at least 1 show a night, sometimes as many as 2. And Maeda is 36 years old when he comes to Brazil, which is not an old man. But if you consider a 36-year-old man in 1914 who has been a professional fighter for most of his life, he's not a young buck anymore. And so they alternate on who is going to compete against each other. These matches would often end in draws for a variety of reasons. They were time limit dependent and did not have points. So a couple of other significant sort of things that I wanted to mention. Maeda's offer always included all comers. All size, all weight, I don't care. Come on, come get some. At this point, this is how Maeda makes his living. And so it's in his interest to drum up interest for amateurs to continue to challenge, because the more people that challenge, the more people bring their friends. The more friends they bring, the more money goes into the coffers of the troop. The rules would evolve as they would with previous tours. And you can see an actual slide of the rules on the next slide. But before we do that, let's talk about how much money this was. Because 500 francs. I'm sure most of y'all don't know what 500 francs translates to even in today's currency, let alone in 1914. However, we did some calculations. So francs were the most stable world currency at the time, more than the Brazilian real, and they were worth roughly 20 cents in US dollars. The franc would later lose a lot of value during World War I, but at this time in 1914, about 5,000 francs is worth about 1,000 US dollars. This would be worth about $25,000 today, in today's dollars. So if you beat Mitsuyo Maeda, if you defeated him, you would get the equivalent of $25,000, just an absurd amount of money. If you survived for 15 minutes with Mitsuyo Maeda, if you didn't tap, if you didn't quit, you got $2,500. Now, that's a lot of money, even today, right? Now, imagine that you're a Brazilian worker, right? There's a profound incentive for, that's a lot of money. And again, there's no record of anybody having won. So the reason I mentioned that there's no record of anyone having won is eventually interest wanes. It's clear that people want to see fights, they want to see challenge matches, but they also want to see fights that they understand. And people don't understand Jiu-Jitsu rules just yet. And if they don't have a rooting interest, if these folks that are challenging never win, it kind of starts to get boring. Especially if you're like, well, you know, when they were through town last time, I saw Maeda go up against Satake, and I'm just going to see that again. So style versus style matchups begin to happen, and those start to happen in 1915. We'll talk about the first one of those later on. But I thought it would be interesting for y'all to see the rules at the time, which, as I mentioned, would evolve later. So the rules that you would have to abide by if you were to challenge Maeda or Satake, or the rules that they would compete under when they went on one of these trips. Gotta be clean, cut your finger and toenails. Some stuff never goes out of style, y'all. They have to wear a kimono. This would change because some people wanted to see no-gi matches, and that would go on later. Some fighters were more comfortable with that than others. You couldn't bite, scratch, headbutt, or punching, or and in some of these, kicks were allowed, which is how Siriako ends up defeating Sadamiyako. When using the foot, the curved part rather than the pointed part, so basically you can't toe punch somebody. You give up by tapping 3 times. Oh, and I skipped over the most important one, which is the very explicit, a fighter would not be considered defeated by pinning his shoulders to the mat. The reason this is so important is that many cultures have wrestling arts where that's how you win, you pin their shoulders. In 1905, Maeda gives a demonstration at West Point in the United States, and he armbars one of the cadets. But the cadet is like, no, your shoulders were down, so I win. And Maeda's like, that's not how this works. But it's controversial at the time. Now, reasons for that controversy we could discuss later. But they thought it was significant enough to make it explicit, like, hey, just because my shoulders are down doesn't mean I'm losing, which is a conversation we still have today with MMA fans. So you have to tap to lose. The ref will declare you beaten if it seems like you're unable to tap, like if you go unconscious, which did happen. They would do 5-minute rounds with 2-minute breaks between the rounds. And if you fall out of the ring, you have to obey the ref's instructions and get back in the center of the ring facing the opponent. This actually becomes super important when Carlos Gracie has his fight with Rufino dos Santos, which we'll talk about later. That is a fun story if you haven't heard it. And by fun, I mean a bit terrifying. So those are the rules, at least at first. And the rules evolve because, remember, if your primary reason for doing this is to make money, you want to entertain the fans. If the fans want to see no-gi matches, if they want to see strikes, if they want to see amateurs, if they want to see professionals, you got to give the people what they want. So let's talk about the timeline with the origins of jiu-jitsu in Brazil here. So Maeda arrives in 1914. He's traveled through the UK already, the US, Cuba, much of Latin America. So in 1915, even though his source of income is the traveling shows, he also teaches a self-defense demonstration for the Rio de Janeiro Police Department. He'll show weapon disarms. He'll show knife defenses. He'll show club defenses. This is important not just because of the rule thing that I talked about before and the forbidden techniques, but also because the military and the police would later become really important for the spread of jiu-jitsu in Brazil, because a lot of Gracies and jiu-jitsu trained folks would train the police, both the secret police and otherwise. That would end up saving the life of one prominent Gracie, and maybe not in the way you think. We'll talk about that later. And the more people see how effective the art is, the more the art is going to spread. So in 1916, Maeda performs at Gastão Gracie's Business Partners Circus, and he meets Gastão for the first time. That's Gastão's son, Gastão Jr. And that is when the whole Maeda-Gracie connection begins to happen. And we'll dive deeper into the Maeda-Gracie connection in a couple of minutes. So in 1920, Maeda is 42 years old. He fights his last fight, except he will do a one-off in Cuba 2 years later. Will go and win a fight in Cuba, which is a place that was always near and dear to his heart. But for the most part, he settles in Belém and teaches jiu-jitsu. And that's where his focus is. He retires at the age of 40. So let's talk about the Gracies briefly, and then we'll hop back to the Gracies later. So and I just want to take the bull by the horns on this one, folks. In recent years, some folks, including Roberto Pedreiro, but a lot of others, have started to question exactly how much Carlos Gracie trained with Maeda himself. And I'm going to address that head on. I'm going to give you some facts. I'm going to give you all the facts we have. I'm going to give you some people's opinions, and then I'm going to give you one interpretation of those facts. So in 1922, Carlos and Maeda are in the same location for roughly 3 years in Belém. And Maeda's not there the whole time because he's traveling, he's barnstorming, he's making appearances. By 1922, Carlos and the Gracie family leave and move to Rio. And he won't train for 6 years before Donato Pires dos Reis, this guy in the center of this photograph right here, recruits him back to jiu-jitsu. So Pires dos Reis asks him to help teach police in Minas Gerais. As for Donato himself, he begins teaching in 1923. And he is allegedly, and as far as we know this is true, there's no evidence that contradicts it. As far as we know, he is the only person in Brazil with a diploma from Maeda that says, hey, you're good to teach. That's his claim, and that's never really been disputed. So Pires dos Reis has been teaching since 1923. So while Maeda is out of town, his either Pires dos Reis or his best student, this guy, Jacinto Ferro, who has the awesome mustache and the barbells, are primarily teaching the classes. Now, Ferro is a really interesting figure. He's the best athlete in his whole Brazilian state, and he's pretty famous at the time. He's famous for cycling. He's famous for weightlifting. He's supposed to be the strongest guy in the whole area. And he's referred to his newspapers as Maeda's most complete student. And so Maeda's touring pretty regularly during that time. And so the question is, like, how much did Carlos really train with Maeda? And we don't have a definitive answer to that. Hela Gracie, who is Carlos's daughter and Roger Gracie's mother, says that mostly he trained with Jacinto Ferro. Some folks say that Pires dos Reis was primarily the instructor because he had the teaching diploma. We don't know that for sure. And so those are the facts that as we have them. And like Carlos Gracie later would describe Donato Pires dos Reis as a former training partner, which is also how the Valente brothers describe him. And the Valente brothers, those folks care about and are as knowledgeable about jiu-jitsu history as anybody. So we can't really say for sure, but here's one interpretation, and spoiler alert, it's my interpretation. So Maeda is the head of the school, in the same way that Royce Gracie is the head of the Royce Gracie Association. But if you go to the average Royce Gracie school, the people teaching the classes are Royce Gracie black belts, like Seth Champ, like Jake Whitfield, folks of that nature. And so your day-to-day instructor might be somebody that's a little different than the head of the school who's on the road a lot. So it seems likely to me that Maeda is the head instructor, but the day-to-day instruction is in the hands of Ferro and Pires dos Reis. So Maeda is probably the most important figure in this story, but there's jiu-jitsu in Brazil before he came. And many of you know this if you came to the first class. The first jiu-jitsu guy in Brazil is Sada Miyako, there on the left. Sada is a jiu-jitsu guy who arrives in 1908 with the first wave of Japanese immigration. And he teaches, and he fights, does all these demonstrations. And he loses a prominent fight, and a very important fight in history that we'll talk about on the next slide. After Maeda and his troop arrive, they're doing these tours, and in 1915, things start to change. And in 1915, they traveled to Rio, partially because it's the big city, folks with money there that'll pay to see them, partially because they need to keep the markets fresh, and maybe folks have gotten tired of the act in Sao Paulo. But, it's clear that people want to see fights. But again, they want to see fights that they understand and they have a rooting interest in. So Maeda whips up some interest, or more likely the promoter of the circus that he's in whips up some interest. And when they arrive in Rio, there are 4 amateur fighters prepared to fight Maeda, and he dispatches all of them pretty quickly. So once you've cleared out the amateur fighters, they start to book style versus style matches. And so the guy on the right, Sadakazu Uyunishi, Raku, is the guy who actually does the first style versus style match. Now, you might remember Raku from our discussion of jiu-jitsu in the United Kingdom. He's the guy who taught Edith Garrett, who is the suffragette who knew jiu-jitsu. And for a long time, he leaves Europe in 1908. And for a lot of times, people thought he died. But we're really in debt to Pedreira here, because Pedreira uncovered the evidence that he actually went to Brazil and joined Maeda's barnstorming troop. So on May 4th, 1915, Raku, Uyunishi, faces a Greco-Roman wrestler named Goldbach. And this is the first style versus style match that we have on record. And he wins by guillotine. So jiu-jitsu guy versus wrestler, jiu-jitsu guy wins by guillotine. It's kind of a common story. And so it's kind of interesting that happened in the first fight later. The next day, this middle guy, Soshiro Satake, fights another wrestler named Matichevich. Now, Matichevich is huge. He's 90 kilograms, around 200 pounds. Satake is around 135. But Satake, who, and like I mentioned, some of these matches are in the gi. Most people want you to use the gi if it's going to be a jiu-jitsu match, but it doesn't always happen. But Satake collar chokes the wrestler. And so this is a real preview of how jiu-jitsu will be sold, because it's basically a small guy against a big wrestler who gets on top and then gets collar choked. And so that's how you can see that this is still how jiu-jitsu is marketed today. The small or weaker opponent against the big aggressive opponent. And the reason that it's marketed that way is because it's true. But at the time, Jiu-Jitsu does have a sales problem, and that sales problem is due to capoeira. And this is one of the most fascinating parts of the story, folks. So capoeira is the Brazilian martial art before Jiu-Jitsu is. And it is described as such in papers at the time. Now, capoeira is fascinating in its own right. It's an Afro-Brazilian martial art practiced by slaves. Brazil was the last nation in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery in the late 1880s. And so the reason that capoeira evolved, it looks like dance fighting, because it is dance fighting, because you didn't want, if you were a slaver and you saw your slaves training martial arts, you would put a stop to it. But if you saw them dancing, you wouldn't be bummed out. So they have drums and music that changes so that if you're training and you see someone coming that shouldn't see you training, you change the music and then they just start dancing. And I think that's fascinating and awesome. And it's part of why capoeira is one of my absolute favorite anti-imperialist martial arts. And here at the time, Brazilians are really, really proud of capoeira. If you look at the papers at the time, they refer to it as Jogo Nacional, which means the national game. For fights from about 1908 until about 1931, you will see capoeira referred to as the Brazilian game, as the Brazilian style. And that starts to change, and this is why. So in 1908, Sadamico, the first jiu-jitsu guy in Brazil, fights Siriaco, who is an Afro-Brazilian, and Siriaco hits him with the stingray's tail kick and knocks him unconscious. And the Brazilians take great pride in this. It's a source of real nationalistic pride here. And all of this is sort of the last taste of jiu-jitsu that people have had because Miyako leaves in 1909. So once Maeda and his troupe arrive, they have to prove that their art works. So there are a series, and the reason I think this is so fascinating is that this is how, because if you've met many Brazilian people, they take great pride in jiu-jitsu as their national art. That didn't happen until the 1930s, really. And that's part of this story about how that became the Brazilian national art. So in 1915, Maeda is giving a barnstorming performance, and he sees Rafael Golfus, a capoeira fighter, sitting ringside. That's May 15th, 1915. And he challenges him. He's like, hey, let's go, Jiu-Jitsu versus capoeira. Golfus asks for 8 days to prepare, but he disappears, and he doesn't take the fight. So, but eventually, Jiu-Jitsu versus capoeira matches do start to happen. And so, in between, and we'll talk about this George Gracie versus Mario Aleixo match at the end, because that, I think, sort of puts the capstone on the whole thing. But in between the Miyako match and the Aleixo match, Maeda destroys a capoeira fighter named Benjamin Constant Azevedo that same year, 1915. He submits him in under 4 minutes. Satake defeats another capoeira fighter called Petabola. That's the same year. This just kind of keeps happening, and news is slow to arrive. In 1928, a few years later, Jao Omori, who is a Japanese immigrant that is also a really important figure in this story, who we'll talk about later, he fights Oswaldo Caetano Vasquez. And what makes this interesting is even in 1928, capoeira is being framed in the newspapers as the Brazilian art. Like, our Brazilian art is going up against Jao Omori and his Japanese art. Now, Omori submits it. Now, a lot of the time, and like Omori also submits a guy named Argemiro Feitosa. Feitosa complains, well, I got submitted because it was in the gi. Let me have a no-gi match. Omori says yes. Omori is one of the fighters that doesn't care whether you wear the gi or not, or he wears the gi or not. Carlos Gracie cares very much, and he will negotiate for the gi in almost all of his fights. Omori doesn't care, and he will fight sem kimono. So he beats Feitosa in the gi. Feitosa asks for a rematch, no gi. Omori gives him a rematch and arm locks him in the rematch. Now, here's the thing. Let's say you're a capoeira fighter and you're seeing all this stuff happen. And like one of the things that Robert Drysdale says that makes the most sense to me is, and you guys all do jiu-jitsu, so you've no doubt seen this. People always talk about, well, that's not real jiu-jitsu, right? Man, you just footlocked a guy. That's not real jiu-jitsu. Oh, you pulled guard? That's not real jiu-jitsu. The real jiu-jitsu is what I do. The berimbolo? That's not real jiu-jitsu. Real jiu-jitsu is takedown, mount, collar jump. The same thing is happening here with capoeira fighters. And Mario Aleixo is saying, man, you're not beating real capoeira fighters. You're beating these scrubs, these dudes that don't know what they're doing. Man, if you were to let me fight, I would do it. And he challenges Carlos Gracie. For a variety of reasons that we don't get into later, he ends up fighting instead Carlos's brother George, who's also a fascinating figure. The Gracies have fought and not just the Gracies, right? We've had Maeda fight capoeira fighters. We had Jao Omori fight capoeira fighters. So Aleixo, who is an instructor and has been teaching jiu-jitsu and capoeira for a long time, fights George Gracie and just gets demolished. we'll say more about that fight later. But the Alesha win is especially significant because of how he'd been complaining about how all the other guys weren't qualified. So after you get beat, you can't really say that anymore. And at this point, you see the rise of jiu-jitsu being referred to as a Brazilian art specifically. And that will play a critical role in Brazil in the 1930s, especially when Helio, Carlos, and George get themselves into a little bit of trouble. That's what we call foreshadowing, folks. So when we say the Gracies, this is a Gracie family tree. And here's the thing. It's an incomplete family tree. Because you can see, Gastao's here, you got Osvaldo, Gastao Jr., George. Helio and Carlos are out on the edges. I tried to fit it on the screen as best I can, and I couldn't because there are more than 100 Gracies involved with the combative arts. So when you hear someone talk about the Gracies, I don't want you to think of the Gracies as a unitary phenomenon. When I first moved here, somebody asked where I had trained before, and I was like, oh yeah, I trained under Hoist. And they said, oh, one of those Gracie schools. And I'm like, don't say that to Hoist. Because here's the thing. When we talk about this prominent fight family, these folks have different politics. They have different emphasis. They have different life experience. There's different generations. Age plays a role. They don't always get along. They don't always agree on stuff. And so if you think about your own family, right, even if you're a close family, you have real divergence probably and real variance in your family. The Gracies are a huge family that have lived through really tumultuous times and achieved so much. And so trying to lump them all together and say the Gracies feel this way, we want to be careful about that because those generalizations are not always accurate. You know, and we'll talk about some of the famous Gracies as we go along in this. But first, to start with this, let's talk about Carlos Gracie and his relationship with Gio Omori. So Gio Omori emigrates from Japan in 1925. He moves to Sao Paulo. And people don't know enough about him because he died a little bit early, unfortunately. But this guy, people should know about him. So basically in 1928, he cleans up Sao Paulo. He beats up everybody. Later, he will start the first jiu-jitsu school in Sao Paulo. And so the growth of jiu-jitsu down in southern Brazil is really, really, you know, it couldn't happen without Gio Omori. So he beats Luta Livre fighters. He beats Luta Romano, Greco-Roman wrestler fighters. He beats Capoeira fighters. Sometimes he fights twice or more in one night and just keeps beating cats. And he's undefeated. He clears it out. So if you want to make a name for yourself at that time, and this is not just about Carlos Gracie, but if you want to make a name for yourself at that time, you want to beat the top guy. Everybody challenges Gio Omori. He fights Roberto Human, who's really significant. He fights all these cats. So I want to mention this because Carlos and Gio have a really interesting relationship. In 1929, they have their first fight. And that's in quotes. The reason that's in quotes is because the two parties' versions of events vary widely. It's unclear whether Omori thought of it as a fight before it happened. He may have thought of it as just a demonstration. Later, he would say Carlos knows nothing of jiu-jitsu, and they would have this sort of public feud in the press about who knew what. And I'll tantalize you with a little thing in a second that to keep in the family. So it's unclear whether he thought that first fight was a demonstration. It goes to a draw. And then Carlos talks about, hey, you know, I'm pretty great. You know, I got a draw with this awesome guy. Incidentally, in the promotion for this first fight, Carlos says about he promotes the fight in the media, and I love this because Carlos promotes himself as an unbeaten fighter, which is true. Nobody's ever beaten him, but he's never fought. So he's unbeaten, but he doesn't win either. And there you start to see the Gracie talent from marketing already. He has been teaching, but we'll get into that in a little bit. So they have their second fight in 1930 after kind of going at each other in the press. And that too ends in a draw, which is a real moral victory for Carlos. He's applauded by the crowd. He's praised by the newspapers. And the two have sort of built this fight together. I mention this because I'm going to say something that may get me in trouble a little bit later. And I just want you to stick a pin in the fact that, so these guys have a fight that may or may not be a fight. It goes to a draw. They go at each other in the press like, you don't know anything. No, I'll beat you. Then they get to another fight, which is a big money fight, and it becomes a draw. And then the next year, Omori's school opens in Sao Paulo. He starts fighting other guys, and Carlos starts managing him. Carlos starts managing Gio Omori, who he's been publicly feuding with, and he manages him with a fight against catch wrestler Manuel Fernandez, and they appear to have struck up a friendship. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. So let's talk about George Gracie, another really underpublicized figure. Because here's the thing, George was the first real fighter in the family, and arguably, not even arguably, George was the champion of the family at the time. He started by training boxing in the 1920s, winning an amateur tournament, studies jiu-jitsu, ends up beating Mario Alessio in 1931. So the rules of that, I want to talk about the rules for his fight with Mario Alessio briefly, because it sort of shows you the evolution. George will compete in submission grappling matches. Like if you saw the rules for the Maeda matches, those are basically submission grappling matches, right? There are some other things that you can do, but there's no punching, right? So George, when he draws with some fighters, George will say, man, I really feel like if I were striking, I would have the edge. And George will often call for either luta livre rules or vale tudo rules. When he has a draw with Joe Omori, he'll say, man, I want to strike next time. And so in a lot of ways, George might be a father of MMA. When he beats Mario Alessio, the rules are negotiated. Alessio doesn't want to wear a kimono, a gi. So George wears a kimono and Alessio wears what is described as a sailor's blouse. These are all things to negotiate back and forth. Like, hey, you want to wear the gi? I don't want to wear a gi. Okay, well, what if you wear this? Strikes are involved, but not punches, because capoeira is a kicking-based martial art. So he can kick, he can't punch. If he knocks George down 3 times, he will be declared the winner. These are all things that are sort of negotiated. And so I show you that as like, if this pole is pure grappling and this pure pole is anything goes, vale tudo, which will happen later. We'll get to vale tudo. This is one of those steps along the continuum, right? Where George is like, yo, I'm a boxer. I want to be able to strike. Oh, the capoeira guy doesn't want me to punch him, but he does want to kick me. All right. Well, we can give a little in order to get a little. I hope that makes sense. And of course, I'll answer any questions you want. So, folks, eventually he becomes estranged. He has a lot of lucha livre matches, a lot of vale tudo matches. Eventually he becomes estranged from Helio and Carlos. He says in the press, my brother Carlos is nothing when it comes to fighting. He also says something in 1940 in an interview that is really interesting, where he gives this bombshell interview, and we have no reason to doubt it. But he basically says, look, we all fixed fights. We all worked matches. And he says, and remember, he doesn't get along with Helio or Carlos. And he says, look, the only 2 guys who never fixed fights were Helio and Yasuhito Ono. They were the only ones who wouldn't do business that way. And so that gives him a lot of credibility, right? If he doesn't get along with his brother, but he's like, yeah, he never worked a fight. Now, I don't want to come off as judgmental when I say that some fights were worked. Because imagine if you are, just to give you an example, Mitsuyo Maeda. You're 36 years old. You got 4 of your friends on tour with you. Every night, you're taking a beating. You're taking punishment. Imagine if I was on tour with Dave, with Eric, right? Am I going to have the same match I've had with Dave 100 times? Am I going to have the same match I've had with Eric when it's like, well, I know that this is going to happen. I feel good about my chances, but man, am I really going to like beat up my body this way? Maybe we should just, it doesn't really matter to me if I win. Maybe we can make this a little more of a demonstration. And so, and this is going to get me in trouble with a lot of people. If you think about what happened with Carlos Gracie and Joe Omori, okay, we had a draw that nobody expected. And we're going to go at each other in the press and like, oh, you don't know anything. Oh, you're a terrible fighter. And then we're going to have a draw and draw a lot of money. And then later, a year later, I'm your manager. I'm not trying to say that that was set up. And I'll just leave that where it is. So in 1932, the Gracies clashed with Rufino dos Santos. Now, Manuel Rufino dos Santos is a catch wrestler. And he's trained in the United States, and he may have trained jiu-jitsu with Dono Pérez dos Reis after he splits with the Gracies. They have a falling out after they open a school together. So in 1931, Rufino dos Santos decides he wants to fight Carlos Gracie. And they do fight after a big negotiation about the rules. And so this happens in 1931, and the interpretation, and I'm gonna go to the next slide, just because this is a very interesting and controversial story. And there was a documentary, about an 18-minute documentary that some catch wrestlers put out in the last year. So in 1931, Rufino dos Santos does not like Carlos Gracie because he thinks that they're just beating up capoeira fighters that are weak fighters, and thinks that he would mess Carlos up if they had a match. So he challenges him. They end up setting up this match. Now, what happens in the match is wildly controversial. Here's what happens, and I'm just going to tell you my interpretation based on the available facts. So this match is 3 rounds. During the first 2 rounds, Rufino takes him down and is on top in Carlos's guard. And so Rufino is on top during most of that and appears to be winning. But then that sort of classic wrestler versus guard player, right? People don't really understand the guard at this time. So during the third round, they go about halfway out of the ropes. Now, depending on who you believe, now the ref does eventually stop them, but Carlos goes for a choke, what's called a gravata. It's described as a gravata, which means headlock. Could mean anything from guillotine choke to collar choke. But Carlos catches him in a choke. Now, Rufino's side says that Carlos grabbed the choke after the ref had already stopped them. Carlos' side strongly disputes that. Here's what I think happened. I think that they were halfway out. And remember, the rules at this time say you got to be all the way out and then the ref stops you. So Carlos goes for the choke. Ref resets them in the middle. Rufino taps, but Rufino also is like, well, hey, you should have stopped it. He didn't have that choke. Dos Santos is described in the press at the time as being groggy. Some people say he was unconscious. He probably wasn't unconscious, but he was getting choked. And he does tap to be let out. But from his perspective, they're out of bounds, right? From Carlos's perspective, I just guillotined you and the match is over. And this is the only way that this match can be decided is by submission. So there are three judges. One judge is like, yeah, it's over. Carlos wins. The other two judges are like, no, Carlos, you got to come back to the match. Carlos is like, I'm not coming back. I won. And so the other two refs decide that Carlos will be disqualified, and they declare Rufino the winner. So that is about as even-handed a description of that fight as I can come up with. Now, why is that fight important? That fight's important because the war of words between these folks will lead to a really powerful incident, not just in Brazilian jiu-jitsu history, but in Brazilian political history. So in 1932, after Rufino dos Santos runs into Carlos and he sits on Carlos's hat, either accidentally or on purpose, Carlos is like, you better be careful. And Rufino's like, why would I be careful? So later, on October 18th, 1932, George, Carlos, and Elio jump him in the street. This is also controversial because according to the newspapers, it's a 3-on-1 beatdown where they have a steel box with them and they hit him in the head with the steel box, and then Carlos armbars him and they leave him laying. The Gracie side, they write a letter about this incident that basically says he was talking shit, and that's sort of their defense of this. This newspaper clipping down here, it has the Gracie Brothers here and Manuel Rufino dos Santos. So in 1930, so basically the Gracies don't think they're going to get in trouble for this, but they're wrong. The three brothers end up spending a week in jail, and when they are tried, and that's what this headline is about, they get sentenced to 2 years in prison for jumping Rufino dos Santos in the street. This wouldn't be the only time that they do a 3-on-1 beatdown of a guy in the street, but that's a topic for another time. So here's where the politics start to come in. In June 1934, Brazil has an authoritarian leader named Getulio Vargas. Vargas takes power in a military coup, and he pardons them. He cites, when he signs the pardon, a groundswell of public opinion. From who, you might ask? Well, a group of prominent citizens write a letter, and it includes these words, and I'm going to directly quote these words. Despite their young age, the Gracie brothers, through their sports performances, became symbols of our nation. Teaching Jiu-Jitsu and its secrets at their gym and to members of the special police force made them invaluable citizens. So this is significant for a lot of different reasons. First of all, the Gracies are being cited as symbols of the nation. So from 1931 to 1934, it's become clear that capoeira is no longer the national martial art. Now it's Jiu-Jitsu. And not only is it Jiu-Jitsu, the Gracies, who have sort of gotten their way into elite society by teaching the Brazilian secret police, as well as police forces, military, are being cited as directly symbols of the nation. Right? So that shows you how the culture has shifted at the time. So they're sentenced to 2 years in prison, but the Brazilian authoritarian leader Vargas pardons them. So who was trying to get them to pardon them? This is where the surprise comes in. And this is where we're going to talk about the first women to train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So that woman on the left, Jocelina Coelho de Lisboa, she is a Portuguese woman who's moved to Brazil. She was born in 1900. She's a poet, she's a feminist, and she's a fascist, which is an odd combination of words, but every culture is a little bit different. She's a fascinating figure. She may be Carlos's first female student. We can't say that for sure, but she's the first female student that we know on record has been training. During my podcast interview with Tufi Kairos, he believes her to be Carlos Gracie's first female student. Carlos will go on to market jiu-jitsu to women in some really fascinating advertisements that I will post to the private Facebook group, where he's basically like, is your man bigger than you? Is your man giving you problems? Learn how to arm lock him, which is kind of interesting too when you think about marketing in Brazil in a patriarchal society that way in the 30s. So she is a signatory of this letter. So she trains. Berta Lutz in the middle here is maybe Brazil's most influential feminist. She's a suffrage leader for Brazil. She also lobbies for the Gracies, and she doesn't train, which really interests me, because one thing that you can say about Helio Gracie is that he was not a feminist. If you ever read the interview he did with Playboy, he holds what we would consider really antiquated and really pretty offensive views about women. And yet, because of sort of Brazilian nationalism and the symbolism that jiu-jitsu has for that nationalism, these two feminists, self-styled feminists, are in his corner. I'm not going to read this whole letter for you, but it's here in the presentation so you can check it out. I want to thank Jose Tufi Kairos, who got this for his dissertation. And basically, these women are signatories to this letter that says, hey, these guys are symbols of the nation, let them go. So let's talk about, and I think that's interesting, and I'm happy to answer any questions about that or anything else. I know we got started a little late, so we got some more fun stuff to come to. So here's the timeline, y'all. In 1922, the Gracies moved to Rio. Carlos doesn't train again until 1928. He starts training again because Donato Pires dos Reis gives him a job as his assistant teaching law enforcement in Minas Gerais. In 1930, Donato Pires dos Reis opens an academy in Rio, which will later become the Gracie Academy. That picture of Donato, George, and Carlos, that's them opening the academy. So in 1931, Donato gets ousted. Either he gets bounced or he leaves. It's really unclear. He has a falling out with the Gracies, and they take over the academy. It'll become the Gracie Academy by 1932. That's the same year that Helio starts taking challenge matches. He arm locks a boxer in about 45 seconds. I also want to mention, too, when talking about Helio, that Helio rules are evolving at this point. And a lot of Japanese fighters, even naturalized Brazilians, are styled in judo rules, which is your aim is to throw him. And judo, as Kano taught it, is basically 80% standing throws and 20% newaza, grappling. So because Helio is focused on jiu-jitsu as a self-defense martial art, he doesn't really care if he gets thrown, as long as he doesn't get submitted or beaten up. And so he has two matches with Yasuhito Ono, who is one, if you recall, who George said was the only other guy that he knew for sure never fixed a fight. And these fights march a significant rule shift, because basically Helio gets thrown more than 20 times in each match, but both are draws because he can't finish Helio due to his defense. And I think this shows both a culture meeting up with another culture, where it's like, hey, I've been taught I got to throw. Okay, I don't know what to do against the guy with defense of this nature. And a guy that's like, I want to create a self-defense-based martial art. What do I care if I end up on my back if I'm alert, conscious, and able to attack? So Helio retires first in 1937. He's very prominent at that point for reasons that you've already seen. But he comes out of retirement in 1951, and he has a couple of famous fights after his retirement. He fights Yukio Kato, chokes him unconscious, which is probably Helio Gracie's signature win. Masahiko Kimura is one of the best judoka ever, and Helio wanted to fight Kimura. But Kimura was like, man, you got to fight Kato first. And nobody expected Helio to win. But Helio was able to collar choke him from the closed guard, and it's a technique that we still teach on the fundamentals curriculum. You know why? Because it still works, even it worked against world-class judoka in 1951, and it works against everybody else today. So that gets him his match with Kimura. So he and if you want to watch that fight with Kimura, it is embedded in this presentation. You can just click that link, and Kimura wins in 13 minutes. He wins with an udegarami. This is the technique that we now know, of course, as the Kimura shoulder lock. He dislocates Helio's shoulder with it and ends up winning. It is still spun as a mortal victory for Helio because Kimura is bigger, he's probably 20 pounds heavier, and of course is one of the best judoka ever. Helio will come out of retirement one more time, and we'll talk about that in a second. So we've talked a lot about Carlos and Helio, both in the first presentation and in this one, but there are some other Gracies that are really important that I want to get to. And that I want to take us through the 50s, the 60s, and then up to today. So in the 50s, a new generation of Gracie fighters happens. Carlson Gracie Sr., who's one of the most important figures in history, becomes the lion of the Gracies. He will fight all comers. He'll fight in the gi. He'll fight no gi. This is a newspaper advertisement from the 1952, which runs through 1933, of young Carlson. I might have said Carlos. Sorry, Carlson. Of young Carlson and his uncle Elio. He's active representing the family in these fights. So a couple of highlights from each of these. Again, there's so many Gracies, we can't really dive as deep as any of them deserve. We could do a whole presentation just on Carlson Gracie. So Carlson has a few signature fights. Valdemar Santana here, who is an Afro-Brazilian black belt at the Gracie Academy, gets kicked out of the Gracie Academy. And Valdemar is angry and challenges Elio, who is 40 years old at the time. And Elio says, sure, I'll fight you. And to his credit, like, Valdemar is a younger man in really good shape, and Elio lasts in a Vale Tudo fight 3.5 hours with Valdemar Santana. At the end, Valdemar soccer kicks Elio in the face, though, and ends up knocking Elio unconscious and winning. Carlson has 2 fights with Valdemar where he wins both fights by choke and therefore avenges the family honor. And that's one of Carlson's most famous things. His other famous thing that I want to tell you about involves Hobson Gracie, who is Carlos's son. Hobson was, for many years, my favorite Gracie because of the story I'm about to tell you. Hobson is the father of Henzo, Half, and Hyan. And so Hobson's one of the most prominent Gracie fighters in the 1950s. He also becomes a leftist. And so after Getulio Vargas takes power in the military coup of 1964, Carlson and Hobson go to a left-wing meeting. Now, how involved they were with this left-wing group is like Carlson appears to be kind of a tourist. He's at the wrong meeting, wrong place at the wrong time. He's interested, but he's not involved. Hobson is involved. So they arrest them both, and they let Carlson go shortly thereafter. And they arrest Hobson with a bunch of other members that are also really involved in this left-wing group. The left-wing group's called Ação Libertadora Nacional. And so the Brazilian secret police arrest him. He is held for 60 days. He is interrogated and tortured for 60 days. Eventually, all the other people that they arrest are executed. Hobson is the only one that is not executed. The reason he is not executed is that he was the jiu-jitsu instructor of a guy named Elio Vigio, who is the head of the Brazilian secret police at the time. And he's like, hey man, can't get that guy. He's my jiu-jitsu instructor. I tell you that story for 2 reasons. First of all, it's harrowing. Second of all, in case I ever get in trouble, I'm your jiu-jitsu instructor. Just get me out of trouble. But in all seriousness, it's just a fascinating turn of events, and and how that, Brazilian politics is really, really interesting. And I don't know near as much about it as I would like to. So Hobson and Carlson, very, very best fighters of the 50s. Carlson is named the best fighter in Brazil at just 22 years old in 1954. Hobson is not far behind him. In the 60s, there's a bit of a lull in jiu-jitsu in the 60s and 70s. Part of that is that Brazilian politics is in upheaval. Part of it is that judo is on the rise as a sport, and that people have decided they really want to watch striking. But jiu-jitsu begins to rise again in the 70s. And the new generation, and these are 2 of the most important Gracies ever, and you've definitely heard of at least one of them. The guy on top, Rickson Gracie. He's the legend of the family, famously 400-0, which is a record that may be apocryphal, but we can say definitively that Rickson has never been beaten. And he's the subject of many stories. In my experience, all of them true. And I'll tell you about those in a second. So this is Rickson on top. This is Halls on the bottom, and this is Rickson and Halls sparring together at a Sambo tournament. So the reason Rickson is significant is he is the family champion, the legend, lots of stories. The reason Halls is significant is he was arguably the family champion, or at least was neck and neck with Rickson. He tragically dies in a hang gliding accident in 1982, but his legacy is still felt today for a lot of reasons. First of all, he's the innovator of the family. He's one of the first guys to be truly, truly open-minded and go train Sambo, go train wrestling, bring techniques back from other arts. One of Hals's black belts is Romero Jacare Cavalcanti, who you may know as not Jacare, who's in the UFC, but Romero Jacare, who is the head of the Alliance Jiu-Jitsu team in Atlanta, which is probably the most successful jiu-jitsu competition team in history. And Romero Jacare is brilliant and a legend in his own right. So we get his black belt from Halls. Robert Drysdale, when he did research for Closed Guard the movie, found that there were a bunch of old jiu-jitsu folks who said they didn't know the triangle. like the Sankaku Jime, the triangle choke, the one that I just taught the other day. They didn't know it. And Holes, studying judo, found it in a judo book and reintroduced it to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Now, this sounds like an apocryphal story, but it's probably true because Homero Jacare says that happened. A couple of other people also say that happened. Marcio Macarao Stambowski says that happened. And if you think about it, I think that that's a really fascinating and empowering thing about jiu-jitsu. Like the triangle, now we can't imagine jiu-jitsu without it. But techniques are cyclical. And certain techniques, like the berimbolo, may become useless if the rules change. And then if the rules change back, people may forget the berimbolo. And so the way that we can always grow and develop as martial artists is to do as Holes did, which is reach out beyond our own martial art, learn what others have done before, and see if it can apply. And to me, jiu-jitsu is the adaptable art because it's the art that is based on what works. I'm like, hey, I found this choke. Let me see if it works. And that is one of Holes's many legacies, along with the fact that he is essentially the father of Alliance, because he gave Romero Jacare his black belt. So he dies of a tragic hang gliding accident in 1982. So I have a lot of Rickson Gracie stories. I've had the privilege of training with Rickson like three or four times, and so has Dave. And here's the thing, guys. There are a lot of legends about whom the stories don't add up. The Rickson stories are true. I'll just say that. And I'll say that definitively. Like, he is as good as you think he is. And when I first trained with Rickson, I was a blue belt, and I was in a room with like 35 black belts, right? And Rickson would show stuff, and all the black belts were like, and it's just, he's just that good. And like, I'm going to stop like fanboying, but I just want to point out that like, there are a lot of haters in the world that try to tear down like really accomplished people. And the stories about Rickson are true. So let me just tell you two of them. The first Rickson story, just more an anecdote, which is there are a lot of prominent jiu-jitsu competition black belts who are among the elite that will say, Rickson comes and he trains with us and I can't do anything to him. And these are dudes that are like legends of the art. Like Andre Galvao is one where he's like, yeah, Rickson came and couldn't do anything to him. I was like, man, you know, if Andre Galvao says that, it's probably true. But there's a really famous story that I really want to tell you all about Yoji Anjo, who is a giant Japanese fighter who tried to Gracie challenge Rickson. If you haven't heard of the Gracie challenge, the Gracies would famously take on all comers to prove that their art worked. And they would fight and they would record, and we didn't have the internet at the time, but they would spread those tapes around. Those tapes later became what's called Gracies in Action, which Horian put together. And so you could see jiu-jitsu guys fighting karate guys, jiu-jitsu guys fighting professional wrestlers, jiu-jitsu guys fighting hapkido guys, and whoever would fight them. So there's a tape of Rickson fighting Yoji Anjo that no one's ever seen, and I'm going to explain why. So Rickson had a school at the time, and Yoji Anjo lived in Japan. Yoji Anjo really wanted to fight Rickson. So he decided that he was going to fly to California, not tell Rickson, and just show up and challenge him, just Gracie challenge him. So he shows up at the gym, Rickson's not there. And he's like, where's Rickson? He's brought a Japanese camera crew with him to document this. And so all of his guys are like, man, he's not here. It's, you know, Saturday or Sunday or whenever. He doesn't come in today. And he's like, oh, I'm here to challenge Rickson. So one of them gets on the phone and tells Rickson, you should get down here. Or, hey, this is happening. How do you want to handle it? Because I don't think anybody would have the balls to say, hey, Rickson, you have to get down here. So Rickson gets the call. Rickson throws on some flip-flops and board shorts, gets on his motorcycle, goes to the academy. He says, okay, we're going to fight. There are going to be no rules for our fight, and there's going to be no media for the fight. You and I are going to go in the gym. We're going to lock the door, and one of us is going to come out. And Rickson, and the only person allowed to be in there was one of Rickson's students who purportedly, and he has confirmed this, that this tape exists, records the fight. And Rickson just absolutely beats the snot out of him. And the photos from Anjo's face the next day are wild. And no one's ever seen the video because Rickson's a samurai like that. The sort of postscript to the story is, so Anjo is then apologetic, actually mails Rickson a samurai helmet and says, I'm sorry, I was wrong. You conducted yourself with honor. Congratulations. That is who Rickson Gracie is. And I urge you to watch the documentary Rickson Gracie Choke, which follows him on a Japanese fight tournament. And it kind of shows you who he is. There's a zillion other Rickson stories, but I've already kept you all a little bit over time. So let's talk about some of the other most significant Gracies. And this will give you some idea of why we're training today. So in 1978, so people think of Horian Gracie as the father of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu in America, and he mostly deserves that. But Carly Gracie, his cousin, is the first Gracie to teach in the USA. He's there several years before Rickson is, teaching in Florida, teaching a little bit to the US military. Rickson actually comes to the US to work in, or not Rickson, Horian comes to the US to work in Hollywood. He becomes a stunt coordinator, becomes a fight choreographer, becomes an extra in Hollywood, and actually appears on an episode of Three's Company, which you can still find on the internet. And I think I posted it to the private Facebook group at one point. But he also has his family's martial arts. So he starts training and teaching out of his garage in Hollywood. And he takes on private students. The first of those students is Richard Bresler here in slide 2. And can you imagine 1978 training with Horian Gracie? I mean, that's kind of it, right? I interviewed Richard Bresler for the Dirty White Belt podcast. You can find that episode if you're interested in hearing what the first guy to train Gracie Jiu-Jitsu in America, what his experience was. So that's a really happy story. And Horian, of course, prospers and eventually founds the Gracie Academy. And, you know, his sons are Henner and Huron, who are amazing and who you've no doubt seen all over the internet. Again, arguably more responsible than anybody for Gracie Jiu-Jitsu in America. But Carly was there first. And the reason that Carly is significant is, yes, because of his teaching, but also because of a lawsuit. So one thing, the Gracies are really good at fighting, and they're really good at marketing. And Horian, when he comes, whenever you have a product, and, and some people do consider Jiu-Jitsu a product, you want to trademark it. And so Horian files for a trademark application for the term Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. And if that had been successful, he would be the only one who would have he and his family would be the only ones that have the right to use it. But Carly, in 1994, Carly sues, and these legal documents are still available on the internet, and you can see them. And he wins a lawsuit over the term Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, basically on the claim, like, look, I'm a Gracie, I've been teaching this as well in the United States. And so that's why other people can say Gracie Jiu-Jitsu to this day. Last thing, we talk about the Dirty Dozen a lot. The first 12 people outside of Brazil to get a black belt. I have interviewed 4 of those people, and I'm going to get them all eventually. But this is the white whale that has gotten away, and this is Craig Cucuck. Craig Cucuck is the first American black belt. He gets his black belt in 1992. If you remember, the first UFC is in 1993. Imagine being an American who got your black belt before Royce Gracie won the first UFC. That's crazy. And I have to give a shout out to my wonderful wife, Betsy, who tracked down Craig Cucuck, found his phone number. I ended up having an incredible conversation with Craig, where he told me all kinds of amazing stories. Cucuck also helped with Henzo produce one of the first DVDs, which was, it wouldn't have been a DVD, it would have been a VHS tape on Jiu-Jitsu at the time. And that stuff is actually still really good. Those techniques are still really high quality. And so imagine getting to have conversations with this guy. And so I was just on, talking to him, having a great time. He doesn't give interviews. And so then I was like, hey, mind if I start recording now? And he's like, yeah, no, I'll call you back. And short version, I don't think he really wants to come on the podcast, which is a bummer, because that dude's story and stories, are ones that deserve telling. And I won't retell them out of respect for his privacy. Oh, so I left one slide in that I didn't mean to leave in. But this is a slide that I wanted you to leave in, which is, some of you may recognize this. This is a scene from Lethal Weapon, the Mel Gibson and Danny Glover vehicle. Horian Gracie did the fight choreography for Lethal Weapon, and you may recognize that as the Sankaku Jime. That's right, the triangle choke that we have still in Jiu-Jitsu, thanks to Holmes Gracie. And I remember even rewatching Lethal Weapon, because in this movie, Mel Gibson chokes him for a little while and then lets him go. And I'm like, man, he had a fully locked triangle. Should have kept going. But that, if you see Jiu-Jitsu in films, particularly of that era, there's a fair chance that Horian had a hand in it. So folks, I'm going to skip past these slides. So in 1993, and we're at the end, and I'd love to, of course, we're going to take questions, but that takes us up to 1993. Because at this point, we were at the point in the story where Horian is in America, he's teaching, he's training, he's producing incredible videotapes that still stand up. But he's in California, right? And this is America in 1993, and he wants to get international exposure for his art. And he comes up with this idea: what if we took the Gracie Challenge to the next level, We put some people in a cage and we just have them fight, and we see how jiu-jitsu does. And that was the Ultimate Fighting Championship, and that is why a lot of people, myself included, are training today. So folks, I want to thank you for your kind attention. You all are awesome. It's good to have a small, passionate group. If anybody has any questions, of course, you know how to get a hold of me. The presentation wouldn't be possible without Tufi Kairos, without Drysdale, without Pedrera, Wendy Rouse for a lot of the women's self-defense stuff, Tony Wolfe, who wrote a great suffragette graphic novel that I drew on for the last couple of presentations. So please support those folks. And this is the penultimate Jiu-Jitsu history class. The next one, we're going to focus on modern sport fighting, about not just the UFC, but also Abu Dhabi Combat Club, about sport jiu-jitsu, the IBJJF. And I will not only give you that history from 1993 up to today, but I will give you my answers for who the best competitors of all time are, which I hope will inspire you to check out their matches. So thanks everybody for listening. And if anybody has any questions, I am thrilled to answer them.
I have one, Jeff.
All right.
So like this is another one of my sort of the name of moves running into our jiu-jitsu as we see it today. So you had mentioned that like the first place that kind of these competition got started was Sao Paulo, right? And there is a pass called the Sao Paulo Pass. So I'm wondering if there's a possibility that you could just like kind of briefly touch on, yeah, like I don't even know if you know, but it's got me curious. I was like, ooh, Sao Paulo. Okay, I've learned that. I'm kind of interested in how that became a thing. Can you touch on that?
I absolutely can. And it's a great question, right? Because the Sao Paulo Pass, like most things, has other names. Dewan Owens, it's one of his best passes, and he'll show it to us when he comes back. So it's also known as the Wilson Pass. I've also heard it called the Overhook Pass because, so there, whenever you have regionalisms, you have stylistic things. Like for example, one of the things I'll just start with, when I came out here, I had never competed under EBI rules. Like in North Carolina, there are no EBI, and for those of you who don't know, Eddie Bravo Invitational rules. And I was like, man, this is really weird. And so when I first started rolling, there was a really heavy emphasis on armbar escapes, on rear naked, on back defense and rear naked choke escapes, and that sort of thing. And I was like, okay, well, cool. I know these techniques, but I wasn't sort of specialized in those things. There's a lot of people that want to compete under that rule set. So when you have regions, like you could take like somebody from up here who's just done that, like Austin Daffron, right, and put him in North Carolina and match him up against the guy who is better at jiu-jitsu, but put them under EBI rules. And Austin would be like, okay, my regional style puts me in a position to do well. So the quick answer to how it got called the Sao Paulo Pass is a lot of guys from Sao Paulo got really good at it. Now, the story of how guys from Sao Paulo got really good at it, and Wilson Hayes, and that's why it's also called the Wilson Pass, is one of the guys that for whom this is true. It's because that evolved to stop flexible guard players. A lot of guard players, like during the time when it developed, the Sao Paulo style of passing, you had Ricardo de la Riva and these guys who had developed these flexible, dangerous open guards. And if you've rolled against a good de la Riva guard player, you don't want that guy to move. So what you want to do is staple him to the mat. And the dudes from Sao Paulo got very good at that. And I think that it was truncated from the Sao Paulo style of passing to, oh, it's the Sao Paulo Pass. Oh, it's those guys from Sao Paulo who do that pass. And I mean, you can probably think of some other examples like that are not necessarily regional, but that's a regional example. Does that answer your question?
It totally does. Thank you. Like I'm always curious about that stuff because of like the difference. I mean, we mentioned Kimura tonight, right? And one of the things that I've always looked at is like, oh, there's the Kimura, but there's also the Sakuraba, right?
Yeah.
Which is, and Dave always talks about how it's like names become synonymous with moves or like an ideology of, I'm even guilty of it calling like, yeah, this is the Dave Porter, whatever. And it's like, hey, if I don't have a problem as long as you do it right. And so whenever those little pieces pop up, I'm always curious about like how that happened.
Dude, I'm glad you are, because I'm curious about that too, because the way a thing is named tells you a lot about the origin of the thing. And sometimes it's the origin of the thing, period. And sometimes it's just the origin of the thing in your mind, because we all have mnemonics that like help us remember, right? And so it's like, oh, the Dave Porter, right? Dave Porter showed me that. Like the move that on my DVD that I call the Space Mountain, I used to call them Michael Lange because I'd seen Michael Lange do it. And I talked to Michael Lange and he was like, dude, I didn't invent that. He didn't say dude, but it was just in my mind. I was like, oh, I got to do that thing that Lange does, right? And so this is why, you all know my line about like, I want three things: world peace, and end to hunger, and standardized jiu-jitsu nomenclature. And it'll never get there. And it shouldn't ever get there because here's the thing. Maybe someday, maybe right now, there's a 14-year-old badass girl in Japan who's going to tap everybody in 10 years. And she's going to tap everybody with a move that she saw Kazushi Sakuraba do that you and I would call the Kimura. And when people, and maybe it'll be a variation. Maybe it won't be the specific Sakuraba, like the one that we all remember from the waist lock when he does this. Maybe she'll have a different setup, but they'll be like, what do you call that? She'll be like, oh, it's the Sakuraba one, because that's who she grew up watching, right? And that I think too is fascinating because it, like, origin stories and genealogies tell you about what's important to people, right? Like when I tell you, like the story of Seth Shamp's gi origami, right? It tells you about where I came from, right? And so that would tell us about that badass Japanese girl who I'm sure exists. And maybe it will be called the Sakuraba one day. Great questions, man. Other questions, guys? Other comments? Mike?
I thought it was really interesting, your description of how the sort of work matches came into jiu-jitsu. It sounds exactly the way that catch wrestling turned into professional wrestling. It's like the same thing, basically, which is really interesting, looking at the ways in which UFC, as like Vale Tudo fighting, has almost started to replace wrestling as the idea of fighting in culture, and like the way that things have cycled around. It's really interesting.
It totally is. And here's the thing too, like, so for those that don't know professional wrestling terminology, when I say something is a work, that means it's choreographed or fixed, or at least predetermined. When I say something is a shoot, that means it's on the up and up. There is also a thing called a worked shoot, where like maybe these two guys really don't like each other, but they both are like, I want to make money. Do you want to make money? Let's pretend to really not like each other and then build. And here's the thing, people get, I will take some heat for this because some people get upset when they're like, when you imply that some of these things were fixed. And there are varying degrees of fixed, right? Like I think the example that I think of, right, like is with Maeda and Satake, who probably had thousands of matches with each other, some of which were like definitely, hey, let's go tonight. But then, like if me and Jesse are on the road for a year and we have the same match every night and we're both like having dinner and like, man, we got to go to our second show. Okay. Like we both know you're going to knee cut past me and then backstep and go for that arm bar. How about we just do that and call it good, right? And I don't think that's nefarious. I think that's understandable. There's also a thing called a worked shoot, which I talked about, but like a different kind of worked shoot. There's one famous thing where, well, in Japanese pro wrestling, and some Japanese pro wrestling is what they call shudo. It's real. Some of it is worked. And there's one famous match that I can actually post where it's clearly a work until one guy just head kicks the other unconscious. And it's like a work for like 7 minutes. And like, I didn't know the story until Jake Whitfield told me the story, where basically this guy had dropped the belt, because it's professional wrestling and it's fixed. And then it was his turn to drop the belt. And he was like, nah, I'm not going to do that, blah, blah, blah. And they're like, okay, cool. Here's what we'll do. We'll have this finish, like the famous Montreal screw job. But then basically they were like, all right, when he drops his hands, just head kick him. And there's video. And so there's, which also, of course, I'm sure I'm going to take some static for suggesting that Carlos's relationship with Omori might not have been like straight up. But if you think about it, like Omori was a bad dude, man. And he had been training legit for a long time. And he beat up everyone in Sao Paulo, like everyone. And like, he cleared out the whole territory. And Carlos had been training charitably 3 years at that point. And so if you imagine Dave Porter getting beat by somebody who's trained 3 years, it's possible. It's not probable, And if you think about like both of these dudes, like being hustlers, anyway, I've said too much, but that's sort of like my sort of, you can definitely see too where it's also like these dudes hate each other and they're going at it in the press. And now one of them is managing the other and promoting his fights. How interesting. So I don't have any information on that, but I also do think that George's comment, I think, is accurate, right? And I think it's really significant. And he has a level of credibility where he's like, I don't even like my brother, but he'd never fix a fight, and neither would this guy own him, and everybody else is suspect. So I think that's significant. In addition to the fixing, and I didn't touch on this much in the presentation, like there's also like I wasn't able to drill down as much as I wanted about how much the rules were up for negotiation, right? Because like Kato couldn't believe he didn't win when he threw Elio 24 times. Elio was like, no man, the rules say submission only. I don't care how much you throw me. And he's like, and that's probably what caused him to make the mistake and get caught with the choke, because he was just frustrated. He was just like, I keep throwing this guy and he doesn't care. He just tries to choke me, and now I'm going to dive and try to choke him, and oh no, I'm unconscious. And like some of these rules that people are like, I mentioned the fight between George and Mario Alessio, where it's like, okay, you get to wear a gi, but you're going to wear a sailor's blouse. Okay, you can kick me, but you can't punch me. If you're on the ground, you can slap, but not close fist. If I get knocked down 3 times, I lose. And those are very complex, but it's like this is what had to happen in order for fights to happen a lot of times, because people wanted to fight, but they also wanted to win. And and like Carlos would not fight without the gi, like period. Joe Omori would fight anybody, no matter what, and he didn't care if he had a gi on or not. And capoeira guys would want the rules to favor them, and grapplers would want the rules to favor them, and and this is why I think ultimately things like Vale Tudo and the UFC became popular, because it's like the Carlos fight with Rufino dos Santos is a perfect example, right? Where it's like, okay, one judge thinks Carlos won. 2 guys are like, nope, got to restart. That's a schmoz, right? It's a mess. And so how do you make sure that doesn't happen? Okay, one of you must be rendered unconscious or tap, and that's just it. And then there's no excuses. Other questions, y'all?
If nobody else has anything to say, I'll ask something else.
Go for it. Before you do, let me hide this thing in case anybody is trying to get me in trouble, and I'll just say the Gracies also 3-on-1 jumped a guy named Joao Baldi, and they also 3-on-1 jumped Donato Paris dos Reis in 1932, although they didn't injure Paris dos Reis, but they injured those other 2 guys really badly. So,
minor detail.
That's like the one good point that Gordon Ryan has made in the past year, is when he talks about how like anyone criticizing him about respect and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu needs to like look at the history of Jiu-Jitsu before they start criticizing him.
Totally. He is absolutely, I think you're correct, both that is a good point and that it is likely the only good point he has had. But yeah, man, it was the Wild West. And I also like the Gracies are an easy target because they're a prominent family. There's a lot of them, and they did do a lot of stuff that deserves criticism. But I will also say there were a lot of other dudes doing the same stuff, which doesn't, of course, excuse it, right? But like one of the interesting things about, and this is why I think Brazilian history is really important to understand, and the social and cultural context. Like, can you imagine a prominent American feminist defending Gordon Ryan if he beats somebody up in the street? You probably can't. But at the time in Brazil, like feminism took a different form because of its different needs, of the different social needs. And so like the one of the reasons that I asked, so one thing that you'll hear a lot, there came a time in Brazilian history for several decades when jiu-jitsu people did not have good reputations. They were considered thugs, they were considered hooligans, with justification, right? Because dudes would just go get in street fights. And yet at the same time, a truth that we can hold at the same time, Carlos and Elio and a lot of other jiu-jitsu guys who were, very street, very hood, would also teach the elite. They would recruit really rich kids that could afford gis, who could afford to pay them, who could afford private lessons, and they would teach from the upper crust of Brazilian society. And of course, later they became the upper crust because, you become wealthy as you build this wealth and power. And so I asked Tufi, I was like, hey man, the dichotomy I see here is like in America, rich kids don't fight their own fights. They have 2 guys named Chet and Lance hold the other guy down. And whatever else might be said about the Gracies, those dudes would handle business, right? And Henzo, who is rich, like a dude tried to mug him, and Henzo chased the guy and beat him up on Twitter, and Henzo could have just been like, you know what, I'm rich, I'll let this guy get away, but he's like, nope. So I asked Tufi, I was like, why was that? Because like you can't imagine, like, let's say Jared Kushner, somebody asked him for his wallet. Jared Kushner's not chasing that guy down and beating him up on Twitter, right? He's calling Chet and Lance, or he's calling like the Secret Service. And so what Tufi says is, because Brazil has had such social upheaval and poverty and social stratification in terms of like rich poor gap, the government could not always guarantee the safety of its citizens, just because law enforcement was corrupt and brutal, and there were parts of the city that you weren't safe, and they couldn't guarantee your safety. And so even if you were a rich kid, you had to learn to fight, because you couldn't be confident the state would protect you all the time. And so that's sort of like how, and for me, like the aside from just like Brazil being a fascinating melange of many cultures and strange politics, it's important to remember that, like, although it too is a democracy and a Western country, that its culture and history are really different. So
yeah, the comment I was going to make was maybe even about next week. The Sakuraba hoist fight was the fight that got me really interested in MMA. I had seen the early UFCs before, and I liked it, but it didn't really draw me in. And then something about like 90 minutes of that, like, just completely absorbed me. And I'm actually really interested in the ways that Jiu-Jitsu responded to how that defeat like went in Vale Tudo.
Yeah, no, we can definitely talk about that. It's interesting too, because like, as somebody that trained under hoist for most of my career, and hoist, for whatever negative might be said about him, hoist changed the world. Like, we wouldn't be training probably if hoist had not won the first several UFCs. Sakuraba wouldn't have fought hoist if hoist hadn't won those early UFCs. And yet hoist is probably not even the 5th best fighter in his family, like, of his generation. And maybe I won't post this because I just said that on tape, but and that's not me trying to disrespect hoist, right? Like, hoist is a legend, but like Hickson, Halls, like Henzo, these dudes are like, there are a lot of bad dudes in the Gracie family. Helson fought, like all these, anyway. So it's interesting. Yeah. But yes, we can definitely talk about that. We definitely talk about Japan. If you haven't seen Hickson Gracie choke, I really recommend it. Yeah. I've kept you all for 30 minutes longer than I meant to, and I'm happy to answer questions all night, because look, I'm a geek for this stuff. So like, if there are other questions, let me know. But if you guys just want to have a cocktail and enjoy your evening, that's fine too.
I gotta go read Star Wars. The kids going to bed.